This is the Granite Beat, a podcast where we highlight New Hampshire journalists, ask them about recent stories they've published, and about what it's like to cover their corner of this small and interesting state. I'm Julie Hart, and I'm here with Adam Drapcho.
Hello.
We are excited, geeking out a bit actually, to have Jason Moon as our guest today. Jason is the journalist behind the many intriguing long-form projects at NHPR, including the breakout success of Bear Brook, a true crime podcast. The first season of Bear Brook was downloaded more than 17 million times, and the second season seems to be just as strong. Thank you for joining us, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
Jason, I usually start out with asking people how they got into journalism, but since you're our first guest from the radio world, I'll ask a slightly different question. Which came first for you, interest in journalism or interest in radio?
Interest in radio. I was the kind of kid in high school. I don't know if this is a kind of kid or if this was just me, but somewhere in the high school, I discovered This American Life and radio storytelling shows like it. And I probably at that point didn't really register to me that what I was hearing was journalism. I just sort of took it as storytelling. And I just sort of fell in love with the medium at that point. And pretty much from the time I was entering undergrad, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so I was bound and determined to make my way to a radio station somewhere, and the type of storytelling I was interested in seemed at that point to really only be happening in the public radio space. Things are a little different now. But then I got to New Hampshire Public Radio and I realized that journalism is actually what powers all of those stories, that you have to find a story to tell. That's important. That's worth being told and worth being investigated, if that's the route you're taking. So it was sort of I came to it with a love of audio and audio storytelling. And then I kind of learned how to become a journalist after that.
Interesting. So how did you land a job at New Hampshire Public Radio then? And what drew you to New Hampshire?
It was the job that drew me here. So I had done a number of internships while I was in college and then afterwards at various either public radio stations or podcasts that I was interested in. So I grew up in Alabama, and one of my internships was at my hometown public radio station, WBHM. But I also worked at sort of like an independent podcast for one internship. And then after college, I did an internship at StoryCorps, which is an oral history project, but they also make a radio show that airs on NPR. When that ended, I knew I wanted to stay in the audio storytelling universe. And so I was just applying all over the country, everywhere, really. And New Hampshire just happened to be the place that got back to me. And that was in 2015.
Did you have a sense then that there was an opportunity for this kind of long-form storytelling, long-form journalism, particularly in New Hampshire?
No, I don't think I did. I think at that point, frankly, I was just trying to get in the door anywhere I could, just get a toehold. I think at that point I had done 5 internships, and in those days it was not expected that internships were paid. So I was sort of at the end of my rope in terms of, I can't be an intern forever. So where the heck can I start to get paid to make radio? And that was NHPR.
Can you give us a sense of what source of resources are necessary to commit to this sort of project? And was it difficult to sell that idea to your superiors at New Hampshire Public Radio? I guess what I'm interested in, was this seen as more of like a gamble that would pay off, as it clearly has, or was it seen as like a philosophical decision that these are stories that should be told and this is the best way to tell them?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said on that topic. And I think perhaps different people at different points thought one or the other of those approaches was what was driving it. So to take the first part of the question, it takes an immense amount of time and resources to make the kind of narrative series that I've been working on for the past several years. I mean, this second season of Bear Brook, I think from the moment I first started looking into the story to publication was maybe 20 months. And so that's, that was about a year of reporting, and then about, at least 6 months of the production side of it, the writing, the editing, the scoring, the mixing, the more editing, and then the more editing, and then the more editing. The figuring out how to tell the story can take almost as long and takes almost as much effort as the reporting that goes into it. And so it's not just like I, found the story and then just like sat down with some notes in front of a microphone. There's a lot of time and love that goes into the scripts and the mixing, down to like, is the pause between these two bits of tape 3 milliseconds, too short or too long, or what have you. So there's a lot that goes into it. And yes, so from a station perspective, I was like, is this the best use of our resources? I think that's a conversation, that's a debate I think it's happening across the whole public radio system, especially at member stations, the smaller stations like NHPR or VPR, or there's dozens and dozens across the country. And you get different answers at different stations. Some people say no, that time is better spent covering daily news and focusing on, I guess, quantity of reporting is one way to look at it. But for whatever reason, around 2015, 16, when I first started working on the reporting that would become Bear Brook season 1, there was, I guess, just the right mix of people here at the station. It felt like the right story, and we decided to take a risk, take a gamble on it. I don't think we ever anyone went into it expecting that like it was gonna pay for itself. And we try not to think in those terms anyways. Does this further the mission, of New Hampshire Public Radio, which is sort of to me, it's one of the fun things about working in journalism and in public media, particularly, is that's the point. It's not about like, can we monetize this? Can we justify it in terms of like how much money it's bringing in? And so, yeah, it's I guess it's a matter of taste for some people as far as whether or not that's a useful form for journalism to take. But it's a long way of saying there were enough people at the station and in the right positions at the station around 2015, 16 that felt like it was. And so I didn't really have to twist anyone's arm at the station to make the first season of Bear Brook happen. In fact, the first person to suggest that maybe this should be a serialized podcast series was actually one of my bosses. So there was already some buy-in at the higher levels of the station about that. And I wouldn't say it wasn't universal, but it was enough, and it still took, I think, 3 years from when we started having those conversations to when season 1 actually came out, partly because we didn't really understand how much work it was going to take, how to staff a project like that. Like, we learned a lot about what it takes, what you have to invest in a project like that with that first season.
I had I was just so blown away by Bear Brook season 1, and I'm in the middle of season 2. I remember listening to it as I was ice skating at a local arena here, and I had the whole rink to myself, and I was listening to it, and I'm in my earbuds, and just circling this ice rink all by myself, and listening to this storytelling, and it was just one of those story experiences that you wish every story could be like that.
There's a blurred line, maybe even an overlap between storytelling and journalism. I imagine some journalists could feel discomfort with this idea because storytelling is sometimes equated with entertainment, while journalism is discovering and delivering necessary and helpful information. Yet in season 2 of Bear Brook, you openly discuss this conflict with the listener. Could you tell us how this conflict played out in structuring your storytelling and why you decided to bring the listener in?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, that's a big theme we wanted to point people to in season 2, that like, look, we're telling you a story, and look, so are these other people that we're talking about. Sort of everyone is doing it. Let's just sort of point that out. And yeah, so it made for a kind of interesting writing, structuring, editing process where we would find ourselves in these kind of like meta conversations about storytelling and reporting, and this kind of layers of that build up on each other. I guess the way it started, why I started to think about that and to include that as a theme in the story was because my first exposure to the case that season 2 is focused on was because I heard about another podcast, another true crime podcast that was coming to New Hampshire to cover it. And I had been interested because of, this is a little bit, if you haven't listened to the final episode, this is a bit of a spoiler for what's coming, but I had been interested in, because of season 1, you may recall that the very end of season 1 involves an amateur sort of web sleuth helping to identify the victims, partly based on information that she'd heard in the podcast. And it was sort of this like weird moment where like the fourth wall was being breached and art and life were like intersecting, and the feedback loop, it was all intermeshed. And that got me just thinking about how that must happen in lots of these kinds of cases, especially in true crime context, and if you look at other examples out there, like the Making a Murderer documentary series on Netflix. I watched both seasons of that show before I started on season 2 of Bear Brook, and it occurred to me that sort of the whole second season of Making a Murderer is documenting things that would have only happened because the first season was created. It just seemed like there was another system here that is affecting people's lives, in the criminal legal system, this sort of like true crime industrial storytelling complex. It's like, if that system like touches your case, sometimes it can make a huge difference. So anyways, that was sort of the original idea for season 2. I was like, oh, I'm going to watch this play out in real time and watch true crime media be made and then affect the case it's covering, but be sort of one step further removed. And it just seemed interesting to me because I'd never heard anything like that or seen anyone try something like that. That was the original idea for the series. If you've been listening, you'll probably thinking that it didn't become the sort of overriding structure of the whole series. But what it did do is it created this framing that you were just talking about in your question for the whole series, of looking at everything that happened in the criminal justice system and the court system and the police, looking at it through this lens of storytelling. Because I was sort of primed for that because I was going to be following around another true crime podcast. So I was already thinking of things in sort of storytelling terms. And then when I started to actually like research the case itself and understand what had happened, it just hit me that was, just sort of different versions of that same process were happening from different groups of people at very different times, from the 1980s to 2 years ago when the Undisclosed podcast came to New Hampshire. And it just felt like a unifying theme across the whole series. And then, of course, if I'm going to do that, I have to reckon with the fact that I'm doing that. And so, it just sort of felt like a natural evolution out of that. I felt if I'm going to be covering true crime as a force within the criminal legal system, then I have to, turn that lens at least partially on myself, while also trying not to make it about myself. That was another challenge throughout. But anyways, very long answer. But that's sort of where the seed started as far as the like showing you the storytelling mechanics at play.
Yeah. So in that same vein, if we're acknowledging that in the storytelling, there is at least a partial component of entertainment, how do you balance that with the idea that these are real human lives, real human suffering and injustice? And that's the root of the stories. What makes it worth to tell the stories? Meanwhile, these people are maybe reliving their trauma.
I think that's the most important question to ask at the outset of probably any story, but especially for me in doing crime reporting or true crime storytelling. You really have to understand why and have a good reason for why you are going to make people relive. For many of them in the story, it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. For, depending on what you believe, for Jason, for Sharon's family, for Sharon, obviously, the stakes could not be higher for these people. And so why do the story is the first question. And then why do the storytelling approach to it? I think the first question is pretty straightforward in Bear Brook season 2. There's the possibility that the state of New Hampshire and the public agencies that operate on all our behalf messed up. And that is a sort of bread and butter kind of journalistic approach as if, back when I was the health reporter for a number of years at the station, if the Department of Health and Human Services had based the decision on some bad science or something, so it's a sort of same kind of accountability reporting in terms of our public institutions. So that's kind of like the big picture for me, reason to do the story at all. And then to take the sort of storytelling approach that we use, that's ultimately it's a question of taste. But for me, the reason I think that approach can be so powerful is, it's what Adam just said about having that experience, that memory of listening to the podcast while ice skating. I don't want to be presumptuous, but I would gather that you probably remember that story and take its meanings and its lessons or whatever you were going to take from it, lodge themselves much more deeply in you than if I had written the story in a AP style, 1,000-word print piece. And that's just because that was my experience as a younger person when I was first kind of falling in love with audio storytelling. It was, the stories that I remember that like really affected me deeply were the ones that were told in this method. But all that said, there's a huge risk in taking the approach in overstepping. And I'm kind of like the first person to cringe at, and particularly in true crime, the overemphasis on entertainment and the lack of sensitivity to people's trauma and the lack of a big picture reason to even do the story in the first place. It's a very fraught medium and very fraught, especially when it comes to doing true crime. So at the end of the day, I think it's ultimately a matter of taste, what's appropriate, what's ethical as far as that goes. But that's how I think about it anyways.
With that being said, I'd like to throw one quote at you that I jotted down during one of the episodes of season 2. What you said was, at the end of the day, in a jury trial, the truth is just what 12 people can agree on. And that was something that really haunted me for like the rest of the day. And I wonder if you had a thought about including that or excluding that from the final script along those lines, and why you decided to leave that in there, what you wanted people to take away from that moment.
Well, thanks for noticing that. That was, I think that gets us back to a little bit of this sort of the storytelling frame and kind of an idea that occurred to me, as I was doing this reporting, that there's these hugely profound questions that a story like this raises, like it's not just like what happened, but like, how do we know what happened ever? Because the stakes of your answer to that question are huge. They are, literally the difference between whether we put people into a prison or not, or in other places, whether we sentence them to death or not. And I think part of what I wanted to do with this sort of, it's all storytelling, everyone's telling a story, was to sort of demystify the court system a little bit, because I think it is easy to, and it's by design that it is. It's sort of, there's this like complexity and rigor to the legal system, but there's also this like aura of authority and power around it, from the robes to the buildings to the architecture of the rooms. And it can sort of feel like it is this higher plane of human operation. But when you look at a case like it's this case at the heart of season 2 of Bear Brook, what you realize is it's just people, it's just people. And that's all a verdict is. And I was so lucky that Cynthia Musso, Jason's attorney with the New England Innocence Project, sort of granted me the gift of this like comparison to theology. But it's almost like there can be a tendency in thinking about the decisions that like courts hand down, that they have some kind of like metaphysical rooting in the capital T truth, and that's just not true, And I think it's helpful for all of us as citizens to just be reminded of that occasionally.
Could you tell us what the personal cost of this type of reporting is for you? These are dark stories. And as you said, it takes years sometimes to report on them. Do you have to be conscious about the effect that it has on your own well-being?
Yeah, I do. Thanks for asking that. It is taxing in a emotionally and sort of personally. These stories don't just. It's hard to kind of leave them at the office. It's. I think we even wrote in the script that I dream about these stories, because one you don't have to dive so deeply into the material, so it becomes kind of consuming in that way. But also because, yeah, these stories feel like, part of the reason I'm drawn to them is because they feel so important to me. They feel so urgently important. I think, especially I think with season 2, and so it's kind of my own fault in that I pick the stories, or I'm drawn to the stories that feel so urgently important, and then I kind of, I guess, suffer under the pressure of that for a year and a half or 2 years or whatever it takes me to do the story. And then even then, it's not like it's finished. I mean, there's going to be things happening in Jason's case for probably for years.
What do you think the success of projects such as Bear Brook means for small market local journalism? Do you think there are any lessons that other outlets should take away?
Part of me feels like in doing this kind of work, I had a little chip on my shoulder about local journalism versus national, quote unquote, national journalism. And I guess I was always a little bugged that, like, I have had a sense of feeling like you don't have to be in New York City to do a great piece of audio documentary. And why the heck are all the good ones coming out of like 2 cities in this country? And they're missing so much, in the ways that, like, people who live in anywhere in the country are going to have blind spots about other parts of the country and just not cover stuff. And so I don't know how much that translates to like other mediums or other kinds of local journalism, but that's how I've kind of thought of it. It's like, there's nothing stopping us, and here's the proof of concept that, like, at a station, a small station like NHPR, if you invest, the right people, give them the time they need, the support they need, you can do this. You don't have to go to the New York Times or Serial or Gimlet or even NPR down in Washington, D.C. to do this kind of work. So I don't know how much that idea extends beyond podcasting and like narrative miniseries like this, but that's just because I don't know as much about other kinds of other mediums. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I hope it is a proof of concept for local journalists at small places to reach big audiences and have big impact, and that's not just the province of the big coastal newsrooms.
So, what advice would you give a smaller newsroom who's looking to start a project in this scope of journalism?
Well, to do this kind of work specifically, I would encourage you to do the research ahead of time to figure out, what you actually need in terms of the staffing for it. Because we sort of learned a lot of those lessons the hard way when we were working on the first season of Bear Brook. As I think I mentioned earlier, it was almost 3 years in between the first bit of reporting I did on season 1 and when we actually released an episode. So that's not ideal. And there were long stretches during those 3 years where I was convinced that it was, we were never going to finish this thing. And, my little pet project was going to die a quiet death in some dark corner of the station. Yeah, that's my first piece of advice, is just understanding, like, who do you need to have? Like, how many people does it take? What's a realistic time frame? Because the other side of this coin is, I think it's possible to be sort of too eager and a bit naive in terms of trying to launch a narrative series like this, like, oh, we'll just give a reporter a microphone and a month, and what else do they need? You can get free audio editing software, and it's not that hard to record yourself. But obviously that's not how it works. So I guess that's my advice for, like, stations or like management or people in charge for how to begin to think about that, is call us. I'd be happy to talk to people about like what you need to do this and some pitfalls to avoid and that kind of stuff.
What are you working on next? Are you able to tell listeners what they might next be able to expect from you?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be developments in Jason Carroll's case for not in the immediate future, but probably later this year. I would expect another episode maybe late this year. And as far as like another big series, I'm helping with my colleague is working on a big one that will hopefully be out this summer, which I can't say too much about. But I'm also always looking for the next one. So if someone's listening right now and has an idea, please feel free to reach out.
We were just commenting in our newsroom the number of unsolved murders that we have in the Lakes region is rather alarming. But I don't know if it's different than any other part of the state. Julie, do you have any other questions for Jason?
No, just if there's anything that we didn't cover, anything else you'd like to share.
No, I don't think so. If I could, I'll just say thank you for inviting me. And I think it's I support the project of what you guys are up to. I think this is a cool idea. So thanks for having me be a part of it.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you join us. Well, thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
The Granite Beat is a project of the Granite State News Collaborative in partnership with the Laconia Daily Sun. We record at the Lakeport Opera House, and our theme music is composed by Bob McCarthy. Thanks also to the Marlin Fitzwater Center at Franklin Pierce University for editing and other support.